Ladies and gentlemen, drivers, gig workers, and everyone in between, welcome to This Week in Rideshare podcast. I am your host, Jared Hoffa. It is Friday, July 19th, and this week, drivers fight back, data tells all, and Uber gives insights. Legal Rideshare breaks it down. And of course, from Legal Rideshare, I'm joined by the co-founder and lead attorney, Bryant Greening. Bryant, happy Friday.
Happy Friday, Jared. Great to be back.
It is. I don't know if you watch The Boys. I'm feeling a little bit like Butcher today. I got the Hawaiian shirt and the beard. Have you seen that show?
I'm not a viewer of that show, but I can definitely tell that you look like that guy.
Yeah, I'm channeling it, which is good. It's a nice summer day in Chicago. It's actually quite nice, so why not?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's enjoy this summer.
Exactly. And actually, the first story we have today, we'll jump right into it, is Chicago-based. And this is drivers fighting back. So Chicago rideshare drivers are fighting back against deactivations. And this is reported from Capital and Maine. And they explain, quote, Chicago rideshare drivers gathered between the first and second terminals of the O'Hare International Airport on June 25th to launch their latest call for change. What they are saying is an end to unfair deactivations. Chicago rideshare drivers have already been pushing for the passage of Chicago Rideshare Living Wage and Safety Ordinance, also known as the FairShare Ordinance, that was introduced last year. Now, that legislation would raise drivers' pay, give them 2 weeks' notice before deactivation, and require Uber and Lyft to share deactivation details with city regulators and drivers, among other regulations. They do go into detail and say last week's demonstration linked the Chicago effort to actually a national campaign protesting deactivations from Activate Respect, which is coordinated by the Chicago Gig Alliance, which supports area workers in food delivery, rideshare, and other industries, plus Gig Workers Rising, a California-based organization advocating for app-based workers. Organizers estimated that about 100 drivers demonstrated between Chicago, Denver, and San Jose. So, Brian, this is nothing new. We obviously know how bad this is, but there's really becoming almost an organized national movement, which is really great.
It really is. It's so important that drivers are banding together to try to solve this problem. Deactivations have been one of the biggest issues in the rideshare community for as long as I can remember. We've been part of this community for a decade now, and this is something that drivers have continually dealt with. There's so little transparency. Drivers can be deactivated for really any reason, on a whim, without notice, without any due process. And it's just not fair. We've said time and time again, look, there are times when drivers need to be deactivated, when there's a safety issue that can be established, when there's repetitive issues with customers. We get it. But 9 times out of 10, it seems that drivers are being deactivated without a reasonable cause, without being notified of their behavior that is at issue, and without an opportunity to defend themselves. All we're asking for is fairness, due process, and some standards. We need to know what gets you deactivated, if there's some complaint that's being made, give a warning, give an opportunity for a driver to change the behavior rather than taking away a job. And when the deactivation comes, there needs to be some sort of hearing. There needs to be an opportunity to hear the driver's side of the story rather than just taking the passenger at their word. And if it's proven that the driver needs to be removed, then so be it. But let's do this in a fair, responsible way.
Yeah, and if you go into the article, just like you said about the kind of the transparency and having some sort of fair response or just a way to counter it, the article really does go into, they cover a few drivers who've been deactivated. One of them, his name was Moses. He was deactivated for, quote unquote, what they said is the passenger felt uncomfortable. So he said, well, okay. So he reached out to the company. I believe it was Uber. And they're like, well, we can't give you any info. So he's like, well, what did I do that was so uncomfortable? And then, of course, in response to the article, Uber said, hey, the driver can reach out to us and call any time. And then he rebutted and said, every time I try to reach out, there's no one that answers. It's a zero sum game. You just can't win if that's what you're dealing with.
Right, and so there's so many problems with that driver's experience. So the passenger feels uncomfortable. Okay, that's a problem. Drivers shouldn't make passengers feel uncomfortable, but there needs to be more information about why and how can we improve this driver's behavior. Maybe there was some cultural difference where the passenger was uncertain of the driver's behavior, but the driver thought that he was acting in an appropriate manner. And just a little bit of communication can go a long way, and we can solve a lot of these problems. There's not a reason that a driver needs to lose their job based on a complaint like that. Now, if the complaint is I felt uncomfortable because the driver was reaching back and trying to touch me, that's a different story. That driver probably should be deactivated, but
Right.
we need to know what the facts are. The driver needs to know what the allegation is. And if it's something that can be corrected with a talking to, let's correct it with a talking to. If it's something that needs to be taken more seriously, at least give the driver an opportunity to know the allegations against them, to have an opportunity to present their side of the story, and to have a fair, neutral person come in and say, okay, this is the outcome. It shouldn't just all be the passenger and the company making these decisions without the driver's input or opportunity to defend themselves.
Absolutely. And again, it's hard to fight something that you have no idea what's going on. So you couldn't. I could have said it better myself. So we'll head on to the second story here. New data reveals the impact of New York City's new minimum wage law. This is from GeekWire, and they reported, quote, delivery drivers working for platforms such as DoorDash and Uber Eats in New York City saw wages grow more than $7 per hour following implementation of a new minimum wage law, according to the report shared by city officials. The report said that while pay per hour increased substantially, tips per hour fell 60% year over year. The company changed tipping mechanisms within their apps after the law went into effect. Now, they have some other takeaways from the report. The number of total workers fell by 9% year over year. Total consumer spending rose by 10% to $108 million. Fees paid by consumers rose to an average of $20.1 million per week, or a 58% year-over-year increase. Interesting study, but from what I understand here, Brian, correct me if I'm wrong, the argument was if you increase it, people aren't going to spend money. It doesn't seem like that's the case.
It doesn't seem like the rideshare companies' arguments have panned out. They were saying that if you increase the hours, or I'm sorry, the money that drivers make per hour, there's going to be less demand. Fees are going to go up so high that customers don't want to use the product. And that's just not what we're seeing. We're seeing that drivers are earning more per hour. That's great. We're seeing that customers are spending more than they were before. It seems to be increased demand. So I think that we're showing that paying drivers a livable wage, allowing them to earn a respectable income and keep a roof over their head, doesn't have any effect on the business model, other than just allowing drivers to have a job that appropriately pays them. So I love seeing the statistics that drivers are making more, and I love seeing the statistics that customers aren't abandoning the apps. This should be a case study for other markets who are considering minimum wage laws and showing that it's just not having the negative effects that the companies claim that it will. Now, the tipping is an interesting component of it. To hear that drivers' tips have gone down. At the end of the day, I would rather know that I'm going to be making a certain level of income rather than relying on tips, which can be variable anyway. So I think that it's kind of like you want to know what the money is that's going to be coming to you. You want to know what your bottom line is and not rely on that variable income anyway. So I'm not overly concerned about that. Obviously, we're rooting for people to tip more, but the minimum wage, I think, is more important.
Yeah, you bring up a good point about that. I wanted to talk about that too. And really, there's two components to the tips. So it says tips per hour fell 60% year over year, but there's two things here. I think one, they don't actually go into detail of how much the tip was, right, per average. So I
Mhm.
imagine the tips are still lower than the money that they're getting for the increase. And the second thing is the companies changed the tipping mechanism when the law went into effect. So they instantly made it harder. So I'm not shocked that the response was, well, people don't even know where to tip or if they need to tip. But like you said, I think it's much better for drivers to have the consistency than say, hey, I might get tipped.
Right. And I think your point is really a good one about the companies changing the tipping mechanism. Perhaps tips would go down some as the fares are going up. But in the same vein, if the drivers, or I'm sorry, if the passengers can't find the tip button, well, that's going to explain at least some of that decrease in tipping. So if the companies make tipping easier, you have to think that that figure that we're looking at, it wouldn't be quite as dramatic as it is.
Right. Yeah. It's to be interesting to watch this and see how this progresses over time. But interesting study for sure. And on to our final story here. Uber rolls out a new feature. This is from The Verge, and they explain, quote, Uber rolled out a new update that lets users search average fares and wait times for planned trips in other cities. The company said it wants to give people who are planning trips or vacations more visibility into how much it would cost to book Uber rides when they get there. The update gives people access to fare and wait time details in approximately 10,000 cities globally, Uber says. The change will start rolling out this week. It did on Tuesday, July 16th. Uber said it wants to take the guesswork out of travel, especially with millions of people expected to make the trip, let's say, to Paris for the Olympics. Now, I find this very interesting as they often talk out of both sides of their mouth. They seem to be okay with giving transparency for the passenger, but not the driver.
Yeah.
Interesting.
It is. I noticed the same thing. I first of all, I think that this is a great idea. I love the transparency. I love putting the information out there so people can make good decisions about how they want to travel around a city that they're not familiar with. Using Paris as an example, perhaps for some families it makes sense to rent a car rather than Uber everywhere because the wait times might be higher than they want or the costs might be higher, and or vice versa. Maybe renting a car would be more expensive. And this just allows them the information that they need to make the decision that's right for them. To your point, I think the drivers could also benefit greatly from an increase in transparency, whether it be in terms of the wages, what to expect in terms of a fare, deactivations, like we talked about earlier. It's Uber seems to prioritize, as you mentioned, transparency for one group of people and make it anything but transparent for the other. So when we hear stories about Uber understanding the importance of transparency, it is a bit ironic given the stances that they've taken on many other issues.
Yeah, it's funny. We both thought the same thing, and it's hard not to see it. And I also just find it really interesting that it'll often be in the same news story the same week that Uber will say we can't do that, and then like you said, for one group of people, they're like, oh yeah, of course we'll do that. That's what we do. Yeah, and I agree with you though. I do think ultimately, I think it's great for the passengers to know that. I think it's smart. I think just ultimately transparency in general is ideal. As we talk about all the time, it would stop a lot of these issues. And every time that we do get the data, as we just saw with the previous story, it kind of sheds light on this sort of ending this sort of boogeyman, you don't know, we know better thing. It when you get the data, when you get the numbers, when you get the transparency, both passengers and drivers can make decisions that are responsible and make sense. And then maybe people aren't so angry. Maybe things aren't escalating. Um, I think all around it's important.
Well, I think one of the reasons why Uber prioritizes transparency for the passenger is they view the passenger as their customer. They want to be seen as the, friendly and here's all the information that you're going to need to make a good decision for you. And that all makes sense from a customer service perspective. But Uber, in a lot of ways, views the driver as their enemy. It's the person, it's the group that's taking away money from their pot. And I think that the reason why a lot of times they're not transparent with drivers is because the data isn't all that good for drivers. They don't want drivers to know just how much money Uber is getting and how little money the driver is getting, or exactly what the information is that they're relying on when deactivating a driver. Sometimes it's easier to just remove a driver from the platform rather than to have a full discussion or hearing about an issue. So there's a reason why there's a lack of transparency with the drivers, and it's because Uber knows that the information that they're keeping from the drivers would probably piss the drivers off if they knew. That's the bottom line. They understand that the data isn't in the driver's favor, so they're shielding them from it.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, it's easier to control it that way, and we've obviously seen that in previous stories, previous legislation, you name it. They're quite good at that. But those are stories for this week. So before we head off into the weekend, of course, Brian, I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, just before the weekend begins, we always remind everybody that if you're involved in an accident or suffer an injury involving an Uber, Lyft, whether you're a driver, passenger, victim, you can come to Legal Rideshare. We offer free consultations. We provide all the information that you need to ensure that you're getting a solid foundation for your insurance claim, having an opportunity to collect every single dime that you're entitled to, whether it's medical bills, lost wages, pain and suffering, any damage that you sustain. Time is always of the essence. Claims don't get better with time, so please come to us early. You can find all of our contact information at LegalRideshare.com.
Awesome. Thank you, Brian. And before we do head off, I want to say, drivers out there, please fill out our driver survey. We're giving away $100 to 5 drivers and a random raffle. If you go to our Facebook page, you'll find it. If you follow Torsten, he talks about it. So please do that. That would be super helpful for all of us. But as I like to say, that is the end of this week in Rideshare. See you next week.